Welcome to this journey through one of the most temporally dislocating locations ever to mark a frontier trail in the Missouri Ozarks. In the years when travel meant calculating distances not just in miles but in hours and days, when arriving on schedule mattered for connecting with suppliers or meeting obligations, when time was measured by sun and season rather than by mechanical precision, there appeared a creek crossing where time itself became unreliable, where minutes could stretch into hours or collapse into seconds, where travelers who entered on one side emerged on the other, having lost time they could not account for and could never recover. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we approach the crossing, where the river ran in one direction and time in another. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we wade into those temporally uncertain waters, consider what time meant on the frontier and how people tracked its passage without the constant reference to clocks that modern life provides. Time was measured by natural cycles, sunrise and sunset, the progression of seasons, the growth of crops, the changing positions of stars. Within a day, time was estimated by the sun's position, by the completion of tasks, by fatigue and hunger, and the body's internal rhythms. This meant that small discrepancies in time were difficult to detect. If you thought a task had taken an hour, but it had actually taken 90 minutes, you might never know the difference unless you had some external reference point to confirm the discrepancy, which made the discovery of significant time loss at Bryant's Crossing so disturbing. This was not a matter of minutes that might go unnoticed, but hours, and sometimes days vanishing from people's lives, gaps in experienced time that were large enough to be undeniable, measurable, and completely inexplicable through any normal understanding of how time functioned or how human perception worked. The year 1891 marked a period of established settlement and regular commerce in the Missouri Ozarks, 50 years after the first major settlement wave, and well into the period when regular trade routes connected isolated communities to larger towns and to the railroad network that was gradually extending into the region. Bryant's Crossing served as one of these connection points, a ford across Swan Creek where a north-south trail met the creek, and where travelers heading between the settlements of Thornfield and Gainesville would cross as part of their regular journey. The crossing was unremarkable in most respects, a wide, shallow section of the creek where the stream bed was gravel rather than mud, where the water in normal conditions ran perhaps a foot deep, where wagons and horses could cross without difficulty during most of the year. The crossing had been in use since at least the 1850s and had served thousands of travelers without incident or reputation for anything unusual. The winter of 1890-1891 was notably cold, with extended periods of below-freezing temperatures that created ice on slower sections of the creek and froze the ground hard enough to make travel difficult. The crossing itself did not freeze completely. The current was strong enough and the water shallow enough that it remained passable even during the coldest periods. But ice formed along the banks and in the slower water near the crossing's edges, creating a landscape of frozen creek margins surrounding the running water of the ford itself. The first documented incident of time loss at the crossing occurred on January 12, 1891, when a mail carrier named Samuel Pierce crossed Bryant's Ford on his regular route from Thornfield to Gainesville. Pierce maintained a careful schedule. His route required him to depart Thornfield at dawn, cross Bryant's Ford around mid-morning, and arrive at Gainesville by early afternoon, covering approximately 25 miles of rough trail in about 8 hours, including stops. On January 12th, Pierce departed Thornfield on schedule, traveled his normal route, and arrived at Bryant's Crossing at what he estimated was 10 o'clock in the morning, based on the sun's position and his internal sense of elapsed time. He crossed the ford without incident. The water was cold, but not frozen. The current was normal. The crossing took the usual few minutes to wade through on horseback. He emerged on the far bank, continued his journey, and arrived at Gainesville in what felt like the normal time frame. But when he reached Gainesville and delivered the mail to the postmaster, he was informed that it was past 5 o'clock in the evening, not the early afternoon arrival time he expected. Pierce insisted this was impossible. His journey had taken its normal duration. He had not stopped for extended periods, and by his estimation he should have arrived hours earlier. But the postmaster's clock was reliable. Other residents confirmed the time, and the sun's position verified that evening was indeed approaching. Pierce had lost approximately 4 hours somewhere during his journey, and he could not account for where those hours had gone. He backtracked his route mentally, trying to identify any period when he might have lost time through unconsciousness or disorientation, but found no gaps in his memory. His experience of the journey had been continuous, normal, unremarkable. Yet the objective evidence was clear. Time, as measured by clocks and sun position, indicated that his journey had taken 4 hours longer than his experience of that journey suggested. Pierce reported the discrepancy to the postmaster and to other residents of Gainesville, expressing his confusion and concern about the missing time. The general consensus was that Pierce had somehow misjudged the time of his departure, or had made errors in estimating elapsed time during the journey, that his internal sense of duration had been wrong rather than time itself having functioned abnormally. This explanation was reasonable and required no extraordinary assumptions, and Pierce himself eventually accepted it as the most likely account, despite his certainty that his time estimates had been accurate. But 2 weeks later, on January 26th, a similar incident occurred involving a different traveler on the same route. A farmer named Thomas Wright crossed Bryant's Ford while traveling north toward Thornfield, entered the crossing in what he estimated was early afternoon, based on having eaten lunch shortly before reaching the creek, and emerged on the far bank to find the sun noticeably lower in the sky than it should have been. When he reached Thornfield and inquired about the time, he discovered that evening was approaching. He had apparently lost 3 to 4 hours during a journey that should have taken perhaps 90 minutes from where he had eaten lunch to his arrival in town. Wright's experience, combined with Pierce's earlier report, created the first suggestion of a pattern. Both men had crossed Bryant's Ford. Both had lost significant time. Both were experienced travelers who knew the route well and who should have been able to estimate travel time accurately. The common factor was the crossing itself, which raised the question of whether something about that specific location was affecting time or travelers' perception of time in ways that created measurable discrepancies between experienced duration and objective elapsed time. Over the following weeks, additional reports accumulated. Not every crossing of Bryant's Ford resulted in time loss, but a significant minority of travelers reported arriving at their destinations hours later than they expected based on their experience of the journey. The time loss was variable. Some people reported losing 2 or 3 hours. Others reported losses of 5 or 6 hours, and in one case, a traveler claimed to have lost an entire day, crossing the ford on a Tuesday morning by his reckoning, but arriving at his destination to find it was Wednesday afternoon. The community's response to these reports was divided. Some believed that something genuinely unusual was occurring at Bryant's Crossing. That time was functioning differently there, in ways that had only recently begun, or that had only recently been noticed. Others maintained that the reports were the result of poor time estimation. that travelers were making errors in judging departure times or in calculating expected arrival times, and that the clustering of reports around Bryant's Crossing was coincidence rather than evidence of a localized temporal anomaly. In early March, a merchant named Robert Hayes decided to conduct a systematic test of the crossing to determine whether time loss was objectively occurring or whether it was merely perceived. Hayes recruited several other men to assist with the test, establishing observation posts on both sides of the crossing and synchronizing their pocket watches to ensure all participants were working from the same baseline time reference. The test was conducted on March 8, 1891. Hayes crossed Bryant's Ford at precisely 10 a.m., according to the synchronized watches, with observers on both banks recording his entry and exit times. Hayes himself carried a watch and monitored it throughout the crossing, which he expected to take approximately 5 minutes, given the ford's width and the normal walking pace for a horse crossing shallow water. According to Hayes's watch and his experience of the crossing, he entered the water at 10 a.m. and emerged on the far bank at 10:05 a.m., exactly the expected duration for the crossing. But according to the observers on the far bank, Hayes emerged from the water at 10:43 a.m., nearly 40 minutes after he had entered on the opposite side. The observers on the near bank confirmed that Hayes had entered at 10 a.m., and all watches were checked again after the crossing to confirm they remained synchronized. Hayes had experienced a 5-minute crossing, while outside observers had measured a 40-minute crossing. The discrepancy was significant, was measured by multiple independent timepieces, and could not be explained through simple errors in time estimation or watch malfunction. Something about crossing Bryant's Ford had caused time to flow differently for the person crossing compared to the rate at which time passed for observers outside the crossing area. This test result transformed the time loss from anecdotal reports into documented phenomenon. Hayes and his fellow observers shared their findings with the community, generating both fascination and concern. If time really did slow down or speed up at Bryant's Crossing, if travelers genuinely lost hours during a crossing that felt like minutes, this had serious implications for anyone using the route. Time lost was time that could not be recovered, hours removed from people's lives without their awareness or consent. Further tests were conducted over the following weeks with varying results. Some crossings produced no measurable time discrepancy. Travelers crossed in the time they expected, and outside observers confirmed that duration. But approximately 1 crossing in 3 produced significant time loss, with travelers experiencing durations of 5 to 10 minutes, while external measurement indicated that 30 to 60 minutes had actually elapsed. Several patterns emerged from these observations. The time loss appeared to be unidirectional. Travelers experienced time passing normally or slowly from their perspective, but they never experienced time passing quickly. A 5-minute subjective crossing might take 40 minutes of objective time, but a crossing that felt like 40 minutes never took only 5 minutes of objective time. Time could be lost, but not gained. The severity of time loss appeared to correlate somewhat with temperature. Crossings conducted during the coldest periods, when ice was most extensive along the creek banks, produced the greatest time discrepancies. Crossings during warmer days or during periods when ice had melted showed less severe or no time loss. This suggested that the phenomenon was connected to cold and ice, though the mechanism remained completely unclear. The phenomenon also appeared to affect the crossing area specifically. The zone of altered time flow extended perhaps 20 feet upstream and downstream from the actual ford, but travelers who approached the creek outside this zone and then walked along the bank without crossing did not experience time loss. Whatever was causing the temporal distortion was localized to the crossing itself, not to the entire creek or to the general area. By April, as temperatures warmed and ice melted from the creek, the frequency and severity of time loss at Bryant's Crossing decreased noticeably. Crossings that had reliably produced 30 to 40-minute time losses in January and February began producing only 10 to 15-minute losses in April, and by May, most crossings produced no measurable discrepancy at all. The phenomenon appeared to be seasonal, tied to winter conditions, and likely to recur when cold weather returned. The community developed strategies for managing the crossing's temporal unpredictability. Travelers who needed to maintain schedules learned to add extra time to their journey estimates when crossing Bryant's Ford during winter, accounting for the possibility that they might lose hours even if the crossing felt normal. Some travelers avoided the crossing entirely during winter months, taking longer routes that bypassed Bryant's Ford in favor of crossings that did not show temporal anomalies. The regular mail route was adjusted to account for the crossing's unreliability, with carriers instructed to depart earlier than previously scheduled to ensure they could arrive at their destinations on time even if they lost hours at the crossing. This accommodation worked reasonably well, though it meant that mail delivery became less predictable during winter months as the severity of time loss at any given crossing could not be forecast in advance. Through the summer and fall of 1891, Bryant's Crossing functioned normally, with no reports of time loss and no discrepancies between experienced duration and measured duration. But as winter approached and temperatures dropped, concern grew about whether the phenomenon would return and whether it would be as severe as it had been the previous winter. The first-time loss of the 1891 to 1892 winter occurred on November 18th, indicating that the phenomenon was indeed returning. Through December and January, the pattern reestablished itself. Approximately one-third of crossings produced measurable time loss, with discrepancies ranging from 15 minutes to more than an hour. The community had expected this recurrence and had prepared for it, but the actual experience of knowing that crossing a particular creek ford might cause you to lose hours from your life was psychologically disturbing in ways that preparation could not entirely mitigate. What made the time loss particularly unsettling was its subjective normalcy. Travelers who lost time did not experience the crossing as slow or strange. It felt completely normal, felt like the 5 or 10 minutes that crossing shallow water should take. The missing hours were not experienced as missing. They were simply gone, removed from the traveler's timeline without creating any gaps in memory or consciousness. You stepped into the water, feeling alert and aware, crossed the creek feeling normal, stepped out of the water still feeling fine, and only later discovered that hours had passed while you thought only minutes had elapsed. This meant that the time loss could not be detected from inside the experience. You could not feel it happening, could not know while crossing that time was being taken from you, could not do anything to prevent or minimize the loss once you had committed to the crossing. The only way to know whether you had lost time was to have external observers, with synchronized watches, or to arrive at your destination and discover that you were hours later than you should have been. The psychological impact of this unpredictability was significant. Every crossing became uncertain. Every journey that included the ford became a gamble where you might lose nothing, or might lose hours depending on factors you could not predict or control. Some travelers found this intolerable and refused to use the crossing at all during winter, even when that meant adding miles to their journeys. Others adapted to the uncertainty, accepting that time loss was simply one of the hazards of frontier travel, no more controllable than weather or terrain. But in February of 1892, an incident occurred that demonstrated that the crossing's temporal effects could be more severe than mere hour-long losses. A young woman named Elizabeth Morrison crossed Bryant's Ford on what she believed was a Thursday morning, traveling from her family's farm to visit relatives in Gainesville. She crossed the ford experiencing what felt like a normal 5-minute wade through cold water, continued her journey, and arrived at her relatives' home to find them shocked to see her. They informed her that it was Saturday afternoon, not Thursday morning. Elizabeth had lost 2 full days somewhere between entering and exiting the crossing. She had no memory of those days, no gaps in her awareness, no sense that anything unusual had occurred. From her perspective, she had crossed the creek on Thursday and arrived at her relative's home perhaps 3 hours later, which would have placed her arrival at Thursday noon. But objective time indicated that more than 50 hours had passed during those subjective 3 hours, and 2 entire days had been removed from her life without her experiencing them. Elizabeth's extreme time loss created alarm in the community, far beyond what the earlier hour-long losses had generated. Losing hours was disturbing. Losing days suggested that the phenomenon was not just creating inconvenience, but was fundamentally dangerous, capable of removing significant portions of people's lives in ways that had implications beyond mere scheduling difficulties. Questions arose about what happened during the lost time. Was Elizabeth somehow suspended in the crossing for 2 days, frozen in time while the world continued around her? Or had she continued moving and functioning during those 2 days without retaining memory of them? The lack of any physical evidence of her presence during the missing days suggested the former. She had not been seen anywhere, had not arrived at intermediate points along her route, had simply vanished from Thursday until Saturday, as far as external observation could determine. If this interpretation was correct, it meant that the crossing was capable of not just slowing time, but of creating a temporal stasis where travelers could be frozen for extended periods while remaining subjectively unaware of the pause. This possibility was terrifying in its implications. A traveler entering the crossing might not emerge for days or weeks or potentially longer, lost in temporal suspension while their life continued to pass outside the crossing's influence. The community convened a meeting to discuss whether Bryant's Crossing should be officially closed, whether the temporal hazard it represented was severe enough to justify forcing travelers to use alternate routes despite the inconvenience. The discussion was contentious. Those who prioritized safety argued that any crossing that could remove days from people's lives should be avoided entirely, that the risk outweighed the convenience of using the most direct route. Others argued that Elizabeth's case was an extreme outlier, that most crossings produced only minor time losses, or no loss at all, and that closing the crossing would create hardship for travelers and commerce that depended on the route. No formal closure was implemented, but a warning system was established. Signs were posted on both approaches to the crossing, informing travelers of the temporal anomaly and advising them to have companions observe their crossing whenever possible, so that if severe time loss occurred, at least someone would know that the traveler had entered the crossing and could send help if they failed to emerge within a reasonable time frame. Through the remainder of the 1891-1892 winter and into the spring of 1892, the crossing continued to produce time losses with varying severity. Most were in the range of 30 to 60 minutes, comparable to what had been observed the previous year. But 2 additional cases of extreme time loss occurred, one traveler losing a full day, another losing approximately 30 hours. These extreme cases remained rare, but were frequent enough to confirm that multi-day losses were a genuine possibility at the crossing, rather than a singular freak occurrence. As spring progressed and temperatures warmed, the frequency and severity of time losses decreased, following the same seasonal pattern that had been observed the previous year. By June, the crossing was functioning normally again, with no measurable temporal discrepancies. The community hoped that the pattern would continue to follow the previous year's trajectory, with normal function through summer and fall, followed by recurrence of time loss when winter returned. But the winter of 1892-1893 brought a change in the pattern. Time losses began earlier, in October rather than November, and were more severe from the start. The first reported loss was 45 minutes, and within weeks travelers were reporting losses of multiple hours even during what would have been considered mild winter conditions the previous years. By December, the crossing was producing time losses on nearly every crossing, rather than the approximate 1 in 3 frequency that had characterized earlier winters. This escalation suggested that the phenomenon was not stable but was intensifying over time, that whatever mechanism or condition created the temporal distortion was becoming more powerful or more persistent. If the pattern continued, the crossing might eventually become completely unusable, producing such severe and consistent time losses that no one could safely cross it. In January of 1893, the most extreme time loss yet documented occurred when a mail carrier entered the crossing on a Monday morning and did not emerge on the far bank until Thursday afternoon. The carrier experienced the crossing as taking approximately 10 minutes, and was shocked to learn that 3.5 days had passed while he waded through water that was never more than knee-deep. This incident finally prompted official action. The Regional Postal Service rerouted mail delivery to avoid Bryant's Crossing entirely, accepting the additional distance and time required by alternate routes as preferable to the unpredictable and potentially extreme time losses at the crossing. Other travelers followed this example, and by February of 1893, traffic through Bryant's Crossing had decreased to a small fraction of what it had been before the temporal phenomenon began. With fewer people crossing, fewer reports of time loss emerged, but those reports that did come suggested that the phenomenon was continuing to intensify. A farmer who crossed in March 1893 lost an entire week, entering the water on a Wednesday and emerging the following Wednesday, having experienced only a normal crossing duration. The man was nearly hysterical when he discovered the loss, unable to comprehend how 7 days had vanished from his life, while he experienced only minutes. By the spring of 1893, the community reached consensus that Bryant's Crossing should be avoided entirely during winter months, that whatever was causing the temporal distortions was too unpredictable and too severe to justify continued use of the route. The crossing remained accessible and was still used by a few individuals during summer months, when temporal effects were minimal or absent, but it was effectively closed for much of the year. As summer progressed, reports of time loss did not cease as they had in previous years. Instead, they continued at reduced frequency and severity, suggesting that the phenomenon was no longer strictly seasonal, but was becoming a permanent feature of the crossing. By fall of 1893, even summer crossings were producing measurable time losses, and the decision was made to close the crossing officially, to remove it from maps and trail guides, and to direct all traffic to alternate routes. The closure was implemented in October 1893, less than 3 years after the first documented case of time loss at the crossing. Signs were posted prohibiting use of the ford, and local law enforcement was tasked with turning back any travelers who attempted to cross despite the warnings. The closure was not absolute. Determined individuals could still reach the crossing and could still attempt to use it. But the official prohibition and the removal of the crossing from recognized routes meant that traffic decreased to essentially zero. Over the following years, occasional reports emerged of people crossing Bryant's Ford despite the closure, either out of ignorance of the temporal hazard or out of deliberate curiosity about the phenomenon. These reports suggested that the time loss effects were continuing and possibly still intensifying. One account from 1896 described a hunter who crossed the ford and lost in 2 weeks, emerging to find that hunting season had ended and that his family had begun searching for him, assuming he was dead. By the turn of the century, the area around Bryant's Crossing had acquired a reputation as dangerous and strange, a place to avoid even when not attempting to cross the creek. Stories circulated about people who had vanished at the crossing and never emerged, lost in temporal suspension that lasted months or years or potentially forever. Whether these stories were based on actual disappearances or were embellishments of the documented time losses, they served to reinforce the community's decision to avoid the location. Modern investigation of Bryant's Crossing is complicated by changes to the landscape and by the passage of more than 130 years since the phenomenon first appeared. The creek still exists, still runs through roughly the same location, though damming and water management have altered its flow patterns and depth. The exact location of the original ford is uncertain. Landmarks have changed, trails have disappeared, and the community that once used the crossing has long since been absorbed into more modern settlement patterns. But occasional reports suggest that temporal effects may persist at or near the location of the original crossing. Hikers who wade through the creek in that general area sometimes report that their GPS-tracked hiking times do not match their subjective experience of duration, that segments of trail that should take 30 minutes by their pace and distance seem to take an hour or more, according to their devices. These discrepancies are typically attributed to GPS errors or to misremembering when they reached particular waypoints, but they echo the historical accounts of time loss in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. Scientific explanations for the documented historical time losses have been proposed, most commonly involving mass delusion or systematic errors in time measurement. The argument is that frontier people lacked accurate timekeeping, that pocket watches were unreliable, and that subjective time estimation was poor enough, that people convinced themselves they had lost time when actually they had simply miscalculated durations. But this explanation struggles to account for the systematic measurements conducted by Robert Hayes and others, the synchronized watches, the multiple independent observers, and the extreme cases where days or weeks were apparently lost. These were not vague feelings of temporal confusion, but measured, documented discrepancies between subjective experience and objective time passage, verified by multiple timepieces and observers. Physical explanations involving unusual gravitational effects, electromagnetic anomalies, or unknown properties of flowing water have been suggested, but lack any mechanism or supporting evidence. Nothing in understood physics allows for localized temporal distortions of the severity reported at Bryant's Crossing, and no natural phenomenon has been identified that it could create such effects. The most honest assessment may be that the temporal anomaly at Bryant's Crossing, if it genuinely occurred as documented, remains unexplained by current scientific understanding. Either the historical accounts are substantially inaccurate, which requires assuming systematic deception or error by multiple independent observers over several years, or something was occurring at that location that violated normal rules about how time flows and that has no parallel in documented scientific observation. What can be said with certainty is that the community along Swan Creek in the 1890s experienced something that they interpreted as severe and unpredictable time loss at a specific creek crossing, that this interpretation caused them to abandon a useful route and to close a ford that had served travelers for decades, and that the phenomenon was documented enough and consistent enough that it entered local historical records and remained part of regional folklore for generations. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Missouri Ozark's most temporally dislocating mysteries, a creek crossing where time refused to flow at consistent rates, where minutes could expand into hours or days, where travelers lost portions of their lives to gaps they never experienced and could not recover. The frozen crossing where time slowed stands as a reminder that time's passage, which we experience as so reliable and consistent, might be less stable than we assume, that there might be places or conditions where duration becomes elastic, and where the fundamental framework through which we organize our existence becomes uncertain and unreliable, taking from us hours and days that we will never know we lost and can never reclaim. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where time became negotiable and where crossing shallow water could cost you days from your life, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between measured time and experienced time, between the duration we live and the duration that passes. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how you would respond to discovering you had lost days, on whether you would cross a ford that might steal hours from your life, on what it means that time itself might not be as absolute as we need it to be. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about time and how you measure its passage, a like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that remind us that the most fundamental constants we depend upon might be more conditional than we realize. Until our next journey into territories where time flows in directions we cannot predict, and where crossings lead not just to opposite banks, but to moments, hours, or days beyond when we should arrive. Travel safely, watch your watches, and remember that somewhere in the Missouri Ozarks there may still be a creek crossing where stepping into water means stepping out of the reliable flow of time, where 5 minutes can become 5 days, and where the only certain thing about crossing is that you cannot know. Until you emerge and check the sun's position, or ask what day it is. How much of your life has passed while you thought you were simply wading through a shallow ford that should have taken only moments to cross?